and I will try to keep things interesting and try to provide a seemingly outrageous opinion so as to keep you awake. And the title of the presentation is called Pushing Expressivism Further, a Narrative Paradigm for Collective Responsibility. And here I want to start by first mentioning two different sentences that we might hear in everyday speech that seem to be attributing some sort of responsibility. We might say that humanity as a whole is responsible for global climate change, or we might also say that the bourgeoisie is responsible for global poverty or global hunger. So with all these sentences, the idea seems to be that we are dealing with some sort of non-agential collective responsibility, because nobody really thinks that these entities in question are agential. They don't really have agency, but we do seem to be attributing some responsibility to them. And my question here is going to be to try to understand, does that make sense? Or is this as silly as saying that lightning is responsible for ruining someone's life by striking one? And here, first I will give an idea of the general literature that I'm kind of building my argument on. And first, and also just to define some key concepts, I'm defining moral responsibility as the special status attributed to the doer of an action due to the action's qualification as good or bad. So it is a specific moral quality that you have. And here I define, in terms of collectives, there are very different opinions. So they can be organized, disorganized, small or large. I am dealing with big and disorganized ones. So here we are dealing with entities such as all of humanity, all men, or entire social classes that are such as the bourgeoisie and so on. So, and these are the entities that I'm kind of dealing with. And there's also, in existing literature at least, some distinction between responsibility and accountability. And they differ in terms of maybe what kind of response they require, if it's just reparation or acceptance and so on. I won't really mention the specific obligations that what I'm trying to draw here might require. Accountability as a term might be preferable for those who think that responsibility requires agency. But I will be using them more or less interchangeably. And then there's also the question, if we're talking about responsibility of a collective responsibility, of distributive or non-distributive responsibility. So here, what I'm dealing with is a kind of responsibility that concerns group members as group members. So it's not reducible to their individual actions or individual responsibility. This is obviously a kind of responsibility that is lighter than what you would have that was distributive. So the responsibility that you might have as member of a collective, such as the SS, for actions that you did as part of the SS, is distributive and it is very grave. But that's not the kind that I'm dealing with here. What I'm dealing with is non-distributive, a much lighter responsibility that might include much lighter obligations as well. And there's also, in terms of the literature, what we hear is that the question of agency is really at the center of the discussions on collective responsibility. And one prominent idea actually questions whether groups have agency at all. And if they don't, then they obviously cannot have collective responsibility. Peter French, that Evrensel also mentioned, opposes that with the idea of the corporate decision-making structure, saying that the corporations with a CID structure can actually bear responsibility because of the specific structure that they have. But in my case, this is a very narrow group in terms of, and it limits responsibility only to entities with very, very strict structures. So that's really out of our scope. Then we also have Deborah Tollefson, who in various papers and a book has used arguments that parallel Strawson's compatibilism regarding free will. She has tried to circumvent the metaphysical debates about the agency of collectives by saying that if we can attribute responsibility to them in an expressive manner, then they are responsible. And that is one method that I find very interesting. And then there's also, because I mentioned the term narrative paradigm in the title, I feel like I'm obligated to mention a work by Cassie Striblin, who has called her theory of narrative responsibility a narrative paradigm. but this is slightly different from mine. Hers is about the narrative conception of self, so finding yourself responsible because of the narrative that you find yourself to be in, and she enlarges it to cover collective responsibility in certain works. But that's a first-person account in terms of the narrative, in terms of who's speaking in the narrative. And as you'll soon see, mine is not first person. And before we move on further to the specific idea, there are a few provisos, some specific details that I want to mention. So this is not about proving that collective responsibility makes sense. I assume that collective responsibility is something that can be held, but I'm trying to create a discussion about the range of bearers of collective responsibility in terms of which collective entities can be counted as bearers of collective responsibility. So there can be a separate proof for what makes collective responsibility tenable, but I'm just assuming that that proof is already done, and that I'm moving on the details. And then also, this is not what I propose is not the sole way of assigning collective responsibility. I believe this model can coexist with others. It's not the only right way of assigning moral responsibility. I just think that this method in particular could be useful for the specific entities that we're dealing with. So that is the general idea. So with that idea, with that settled, let's examine a prominent model in current literature, the Tollefson model, as I like to call it. So this was developed by Deborah Tollefson, as I had mentioned, and it takes P.S. Strawson's freedom and resentment as its basis. So Strawson had offered an expressivist solution to the free will debate. He had said that moral judgments only express praise or blame, and they're at the center of our social life. We can test them with global and local excuses. So the question of whether we have free will or not is irrelevant, because we already have these global and local excuses to test our claims. So Tollefson applies this approach to collectives. She asks, are there reactions to collectives as collectives? So she gives the example of cigarette companies. And she says that since people seem to be very, in some cases, very acutely praising or blaming them for specific things, then this does seem to be a part of our social existence. And furthermore, there do seem to be global and local excuses. So we can see that if the collectives in question lack their agency due to global or local excuses, then in Tollefson's model, we actually do excuse them. We can say, oh yes, you're not responsible. So we do seem to be taking these kinds of things into account. So one example is the question of addressability. So we can actually praise or blame these entities because they respond. To when we address them. So she gives the example of, once again, the company Benetton for a very unfortunate ad campaign, and she says that people reacted to that ad campaign expecting that their address would be met by Benetton, and that led to a result of company policy changing. And then there's also a local excuse, such as, say, if a local branch of a company is forced to do something by the global branch, the larger branch, then the local branch is usually excused. So that we do seem to be taking these kinds of things into account. And in a similar way to Strawson's method, this seems to show that the metaphysical debate can be circumvented. And this expressivist model is useful, but there are some limitations. So the main problem is that addressability as a condition limits the scope to only agential groups. And I argue that in the way we actually attribute responsibility in our daily lives, that's not how we do things. So I had given the example of global warming and global injustice, and those seem to make sense to a certain extent. Or we can also take concepts such as the notion of Kollektiv Schuld in German, where there was the idea that the entire German nation was somehow responsible for the advent of the Nazis and their crimes, and that this kind of collective responsibility needed to be taken into account by the entire nation and for the Holocaust and so on. So that cannot be really explained by Tollefson's model, since Germany as a nation is not really addressable, at least the German nation and not the German state. Or again, there's the idea of the very feminist critique of masculinity, where the idea that all men are responsible to a certain extent by the problems caused by patriarchy, there's not really an addressable entity that in the form of the patriarchy, but there does seem to be some collective responsibility that falls on people of a certain gender to try and alleviate things. And we can apply some solutions to this question. So there have been some methods that have been tried that I want to mention. So for instance, there have been the idea by David Silver about the idea of an industrial culture. So he explains this he uses this to explain the 2008 financial crisis. He says that even though there is no agential entity in the financial industry, that in their actions, the industry as a whole had a culture that actively encouraged the risky behavior that led to the crisis, and so they could be held accountable. That is one idea, but there we need to define what the industrial culture is, and it seems to apply to, once again, a very strict subsection of basically industries that have a specific culture, but that is also a solution. And then there's also our very own, so that leads to some sort of collective accountability without agency. And then there's also our very own Bill Ringe, who in a 2020 paper had said that a group may arise out of an act of calling out. So he used this to discuss global responsibilities that we might have in regarding to the ought implies can principle. But leaving the details of the paper aside, the idea that I like to study is this notion that, for instance, there might be a class that is acting very vacuously, and they're not really acting as a group, but they're just, everyone individually is really not acting properly. And when the teacher calls them out on this, when the teacher says, you need to get your act together, that can create a group from that specific moment. Then when they become aware of what they need to do, that could constitute the collective that is supposed to be responsible. But here again, the idea seems to be effective only once the calling out has been done, and may not necessarily cover the wider range of cases that I wanted to cover. So these are all interesting choices, but I think a bigger shift in a method is needed on moral responsibility scope and attribution method. And I think these fall short in that extent. And in that case, I propose a different model that I call provisionally an empathic narrative model of collective responsibility. And this is based on Remy Deeb's work on empathic sentimentalism. And as a fun fact, Remy Deeb himself, the last time I checked, was in the same department in the University of Memphis as Deborah Tollefson. I don't know if they have ever discussed to combine their theories together, but I think it can be done. And my attempt is trying to prove that in a sense. And Remy Deeb normally uses this to explain individual responsibility. He, for instance, says that we might blame a terrorist individually because we have lost a friend due to their attack, and the reason, and he wonders why we're telling these emotional details about losing this friend, and why that makes them responsible, that makes the terrorist responsible. And here the idea seems to be that our moral sentiments are actually guided by the empathy that we're trying to draw by telling this story. And he applies this to individual cases, as I said, but I believe this can be used so that collective entities can also be bearers of responsibility. And in order to do that, we assume that there's a perpetrator, the person who has done something, or the person or collective that has done something that is positive or negative, a victim, not necessarily in the negative sense, but someone who has been subjected to the action in question. And we assume ourselves to be the third party observing this event, or observing the victim's tale at least. And following this model, we can say that the moral judgment actually is based on the story that the victim tells. The victim may praise or blame them for what they have done, and they try to, and their praise or blame evokes some sort of emotion that we then judge using our own empathic judgment. And if we find this emotion to be resonant, then we seem to agree that yes, the victim is right. The perpetrator in question, whether it's a collective or a person, is responsible to a certain extent. And then we can test the validity of this judgment according to how well we empathize with the story. So if a story might seem to be overreacting to something, we might say, well, yes, I understand where you're coming from, but this is really overreacting. And then we can say that this story does not make sense in that regard. And there seems to be then some way of modulating the appropriateness of the moral judgment. And I believe that the advantages to this model, at least its results, are that it is, first of all, expressivist like Tollefson's model. So it goes around the metaphysical questions about whether these collective entities are metaphysically really agents or whether they are really solely responsible for the actions and so on. Instead it says that this is based on the moral propositions are non-descriptive, and I had used non-cognitive, but either can be used, I think, in a sense. And this approach focuses on the story and empathy, and it is based on the victim's story. So the victim's word is the starting point, but then it is judged according to its appropriateness. So it can still be attenuated if the story makes no sense, or if the story does not evoke an emotional response. But I believe the fact that it starts from the victim's point of view is also in line with the moral sentiments that we might have in any case. But then there are, of course, some but then there are some reminders that are in order. So this is, of course, non-distributive responsibility. So I am not saying that individual responsibility could be determined through this model, as I think the kind of responsibility that arises out of such a story is not really, it is weak. It is too weak for that. But some kind of non-distributive responsibility could be attained, and that could have its specific kind of obligations that could be up for discussion later on. And then the victim story is the basis, but it's only the starting point. So it is put under scrutiny. This is different from Striblin's narrative paradigm, where Striblin actually says that the self-narrative that we have is the only point of moral responsibility. But I think that the story itself should not be taken for granted. It should be put under scrutiny, but it should serve as the starting point, as the idea. And then with those reminders in mind, there are still some problems that might be asked, and I'd like to preemptively cover them. But if there are others, or if you want me to go into detail, I'd be more than happy to do in the Q&A section. And one obvious one, I think, is the idea that if moral responsibility for such collectives is completely based on narratives, well, can't we just empathize with dangerous narratives or untrue narratives? And in these cases, then say, couldn't Nazis then tell the story of how their country was ruined by these collectives called the global Jewry that has done these horrible things? And even though that story is completely nonsensical, completely wrong, and actually completely heinous, if they tell their story in a sufficiently empathic manner, shouldn't we then attribute responsibility as the Nazi would like? And I would say that this is kind of prevented by one thing that Deebs mentions in his theory, which is the idea of effective dignity. So he mentions that the story with which we empathize must care about the effective dignity of the perpetrator as well. So we must be able to achieve some sort of objectivity by assuming that everyone that takes part in the story is worthy of effective dignity and is kind of considered to be respected to a certain extent. So the Nazi story completely fails because it does not treat the Jews with effective dignity. It considers them to be subhuman. That is why it is immediately dismissed. But the effective dignity condition kind of helps create some sense of objectivity in the narratives that we're trying to build. And then there's also another risk of turning into animism, so to speak. And this was what I mentioned this is what I teased in the introduction by saying that if we're not really asking any metaphysical questions about the appropriateness of responsibility bearing, if we say that anything that passes as a perpetrator in a story can bear responsibility, then can't we just say that if a story is told with sufficient poise and affect, then we can be convinced that a force of nature is also responsible? And I think this is once again an interesting point of view, and I think the quick answer that I can give to that is the idea that the actions of natural entities such as lightning or anything else can be explained objectively as scientific phenomena. They are deterministic actors that only act due to a specific causal chain. And the matter with humans, at least so far, is the idea, there's the fact that we do not really have the same causal chain to establish our actions, since humans cannot be deterministic in this way, then collectives are even more of a mystery. And this means that I think it is this inability to explain things deterministically that makes narratives possible. So this would mean, of course, that an entity would stop being an appropriate target for responsibility if all of its actions could be explained deterministically. But I think that also just makes sense with the intuitions that we would have. So with that in mind, there are possible directions that I think this model can take. This model can take the discussion around moral responsibility to the questions of what kinds of exact collectives can be responsible. I've mentioned that it's only large and indeterminate groups, but we can be more strict than that, obviously. We can mention if this applies to social classes. We can mention if this applies to specific genders and so on. And I believe that would be an interesting discussion. And also, if empathy decides moral judgment, can there be specific rules and criteria that make a story more likely to be empathized with? So can there be a narrative logic that kind of supplants the formal logic that we would normally use to determine the truth of a moral proposition? Could this narrative logic act as an alternative truth predicate for moral sentences in a way? Can we then also find the kind of obligations that arise out of this model? Would it just be accepting the responsibility? Would it be some sort of reparation, some sort of a duty of remembrance of the story that is being told? And also, there's also the question of how do our background assumptions interface with our empathy? Is this a problem for the model? The fact that different assumptions that we have can change the way we empathize with things and make us more likely or less likely to empathize with things. Does that hamper the model, or does it give it a strength in explaining why some people accept some entities as responsibility bearers while others don't? So I believe this could serve as a way of describing why we have moral disagreements potentially. But ultimately, I think such a model expands the notion of responsibility in a way that makes more things responsibility bearers. That allows us to explain why we think certain things should be blamed or praised. And I think that can make things slightly fairer, and ultimately should that be the goal of moral responsibility. So this is my bibliography for this paper, and thank you for listening. You are muted, I think, Bill.
Okay, so we've got, I think, at least 10 minutes for questions, maybe 15 minutes for questions. So let's start with Professor Ludwig first. Go ahead, Kirk.
Thank you. I enjoyed the talk. Two quick remarks. One is that if you're thinking about moral responsibilities grounding in a victim narrative, then it's not really clear it's going to fully fit examples like global warming, where most of the harms are going to be in the future, And I think we should be held responsible now without a narrative, any of the future victims' narratives being involved. The other thought is that there may be, more hope for a cognitive approach to this, because it seems to me that if we start with smaller scale cases, we can tell a story about how to hold people individually responsible on the basis they're doing something which they're jointly causally responsible for some harm. And basically the idea is that we have individual duties not to cause harm. And if we see that in concert with others, the joint result of our actions is to bring about a harm, then each of us has a duty not to contribute. And if it requires some organized collective response, then each of us has a duty to collectivize in such a way as to prevent the harm or ameliorate the harms that we've done. So I think there's some hope, actually, just using more ordinary kinds of moral principles and thinking from the individual point of view, to arguing from attributions of responsibility to group on the basis of joint calls for responsibility to individual responsibilities to change behavior and to collectivize as appropriate.
Well, regarding the first remark, I'd say it is true that this case can cover a lot of cases such as global warming, where the harm done is not to a specific victim now, but to a victim in the future, or even better, to a victim that is not necessarily capable of narrativizing. So we might say that. So Deebs mentions the case of animals, or that could potentially be responsibility inflictors, so to speak, if we can imagine a narrative that they would tell regarding the cruelty that they have received. And I think perhaps one way of pivoting this theory would be to say that it's not necessarily based on the actual real narrative that is told by the victim, but a hypothetical narrative that could be told. And in that case, we can expand the cases to future scenarios or non-intelligent entities such as animals and wildlife. And I think that is one way of doing accounting for what you have mentioned. And then for the second question, well, the cognitive approach might indeed be possible. As I have mentioned initially, this is not. I don't find this to be the ultimate method of attributing responsibility, and I think it can coexist or even cooperate with cognitive methods as well, potentially.
Okay, Murali.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm a bit worried about your principle violating universalizability. So it might just turn out that on one occasion, the same kind of act, so maybe in the 60s, certain kinds of behavior which we don't find acceptable at all now, didn't give rise to people feeling resentment or violated. So the victims in those cases, they were quite happy to let things go. But now, people are very easily offended, get hurt, and then they have a narrative. So I think there's a problem about universalizability in two directions, as it were. Do you want to say that the people, the perpetrators in the 60s were not responsible then, they are not responsible now, or I'm not quite sure how you go about it, or you want to say that the present people are responsible and the previous people weren't responsible?
That's a very good question. And I kind of think that descriptively speaking, at least, this way of looking at things definitely explains why we see a lot more outrage on what has on things that that used to be seen as normal in Hollywood and so on, for instance, but now that now draw a lot of resentment, and I think rightly. And I think one way of dealing with this universalizability question would be to kind of tie it back to the notion of background notions. So I think the main difference there would be that what is seen as acceptable or what is seen as deplorable or praisable may shift over time. And I think it's also important to distinguish this bit from some things that were also found deplorable then, but just were not brought to light because of power structures or basically justice not being done, so to speak. And I think there can be different ways of approaching it. So, I mean, one difference would be, as I said, in terms of scandals of sexual harassment in Hollywood and the way comedy is done now compared to 10, 20 years ago. So in the first example, I don't think that sexual harassment was ever acceptable at all in the 60s, in the 70s, or now. But it's just that the power structures would have prevented people from speaking out, from precisely telling these narratives to deplore what has happened. And that could make it seem that like these things were okay then. And that is, I think that is not. I
just wonder whether that's wishful thinking, you know. I mean, let's change the example of something like a slur. People are very easily offended now by certain kinds of slurs, which in the past, other people might just say, yeah, fine, you know, you call me that, I'll call you this. There's absolutely no, there's no sense that they feel they're a victim in some sense or hurt.
I mean,
it seems odd to say that when somebody is offended, then the person's that you hold them responsible. But when a person isn't offended, and it needn't be, you know, past and present. It could be present in one location, present in a different culture. But it just seems really odd not for responsibility to be something universalizable. We tend to think of it as a moral kind of view.
Well, so that was what I was going to mention with the second examples I was going to give with the comedy. But when you mentioned slurs, I think, well, for example, one instance could be, well, specific ethnic slurs or racial slurs, such as the N-word, are very much not appropriate for any situation whatsoever right now. But say they were so appropriate that Kant was very happy to use them in ethnographic context in any books he wrote in the 18th century. So there, the difference is clearly that there has been a shift in how that word has been perceived. And I think that could be explained with background assumptions. So with the background assumptions that Kant would have in terms of how racial structures work, or with the racial essentialist view, and what that word specifically means and what purpose it serves would be very different from someone using the M-word now, where it would be only for derogatory reasons with the intention of hurting someone. So that kind of change in the background assumptions, I think, explains things. It makes things less universalizable, yes, but I do think we need to explain some degree of moral pluralism to an extent, but this does not necessarily mean that everything is relative.
Thanks.